Somewhere in the highlands of Africa, a priest opens a book that most of the world has never seen. It is written by hand, on animal skin, in a language almost no one alive still speaks, and it holds more books than the Bible in your home. This is the Ethiopian Bible, and it is not a copy or a variation of the book you know. In many ways, it is older, wider, and stranger than almost any scripture still read today. Most Bibles in the West hold 66 books. The Ethiopian canon holds far more, by the broadest count, 81. Tucked inside are writings the rest of Christianity quietly set aside, and in some cases nearly lost forever. To understand how that happened, and why it matters, we have to travel to one of the oldest Christian lands on earth, high in the mountains of Ethiopia. Ethiopia did not receive Christianity late, as an import from Europe. It embraced the faith in the 4th century, making it one of the very first nations on earth to adopt Christianity as a state religion. Its church is called the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. The word Tewahedo means a made one, a statement about the united nature of Christ, and a hint at how ancient and distinct this tradition is. For much of its history, this church stood almost alone, cut off by deserts and mountains from the rest of the Christian world. And that isolation preserved something remarkable. While councils and scholars in Rome and Constantinople slowly narrowed which books belonged in the Bible, Ethiopia kept a broader, more ancient collection, one that had never been trimmed down. So what exactly is in it? The Ethiopian Bible contains all the familiar scriptures, the books of Moses, the Psalms, the prophets, the 4 Gospels, the letters of Paul. But it does not stop there. Alongside them sit books that most Christians today have never read, and many have never even heard of. Books like the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Meqabyan. The Ethiopian Church kept them all. These are not late additions or forgeries invented in Ethiopia. Many are genuinely ancient, some older than parts of the New Testament, writings that once circulated widely among Jews and early Christians before being set aside elsewhere. To see why they matter, look closely at the most famous of them all, a book that vanished from Western Bibles for more than 1,000 years and survived, complete, only here. The Book of Enoch. Enoch is named for a mysterious figure in Genesis, a man who walked with God, and then, the text says, was not, for God took him. He did not die in the ordinary way, and a whole book was attributed to him. What that book contains is extraordinary. The Book of Enoch tells of a group of heavenly beings called the Watchers, who, it says, descended to the earth in the days before the Great Flood. It describes their fall, their teaching of forbidden knowledge to humankind, the corruption that spread across the world, and the sweeping judgment that followed. It is vivid, cosmic, and unlike anything in the shorter Genesis account. It expands on a strange, brief passage in Genesis about the sons of God and mighty men of old, and it paints early cosmic history on a scale the short Genesis account only hints at. For centuries, Enoch was read and respected. It was quoted, almost word for word, in the New Testament itself, in the small letter of Jude, which cites Enoch, the 7th from Adam, by name. And yet, over time, the wider church stopped copying it. In the West and in much of the East, the Book of Enoch fell out of the canon, and then out of memory. Its full text simply disappeared from European libraries. For over 1,000 years, Western scholars knew Enoch only as a name, a lost book, quoted by ancient writers but nowhere to be found. Many assumed it was gone forever. Then, in the 18th century, a Scottish traveller named James Bruce journeyed deep into Ethiopia. And there, still being read and copied in the Highland churches, was the complete Book of Enoch, preserved in Gez. The book the rest of the world had lost had never been lost in Ethiopia at all. It had been quietly carried, generation after generation, by the very church that the West had almost forgotten. Enoch is only the beginning. Consider the Book of Jubilees, another ancient text the Ethiopian Bible preserves in full. Jubilees retells the stories of Genesis and the early Exodus, but arranged into great cycles of years. Jubilees are 49 years each, presenting sacred history as a vast, ordered calendar stretching from creation onward. It preserves traditions and details found nowhere in the standard text, a fuller, older memory of the same foundational stories, kept alive when other versions faded. Then there are the 3 books of Meqabyan, the Ethiopian Maccabees. Despite the name, they are largely distinct from the Maccabees books known in other Bibles, unique works of faith and endurance under persecution. And there are more still, additional psalms, expanded prayers, wisdom writings, and church orders that shape how this ancient tradition worships to this day. Taken together, these extra books are not random. They are a window into the wider world of ancient scripture, the fuller library that early believers once knew, before it was narrowed elsewhere. So how did this remote mountain kingdom become the great keeper of these lost books? The answer reaches back to the very beginning of the faith. The New Testament itself records Ethiopia's early link to the faith. In the Book of Acts, an Ethiopian official, a treasurer of the queen, is traveling home from Jerusalem, reading the prophet Isaiah in his chariot. He does not understand what he reads until he meets Philip, one of the early followers of Jesus, who explains the scripture to him. The official believes and is baptized right there by the roadside. He then continues home, the tradition holds, carrying the new faith south with him, a seed of Christianity planted in Africa in the very first generation. Centuries later, that seed became a kingdom's faith. In the 4th century, Ethiopia was home to the powerful and wealthy Kingdom of Aksum, a trading empire whose ships reached across the Red Sea. Axum raised towering carved stone obelisks taller than most buildings of its age, minted its own gold coins, and controlled the trade routes of the Red Sea. One ancient writer ranked it among the 4 great powers of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. And in that kingdom, a story of shipwreck and providence would bring the Christian scriptures to the throne itself. It centers on a young man named Frumentius. According to the ancient accounts, Frumentius was a young Christian traveler shipwrecked on the Red Sea coast and brought to the royal court of Axum. There he rose to a position of trust, tutoring the young prince, and quietly gathered the Christian merchants of the kingdom to worship, planting the faith at the very heart of the throne. In time he traveled to Alexandria in Egypt, then a great center of Christianity, and was appointed the first bishop of Ethiopia. He returned as Abba Salama, Father of Peace, to lead a new church. Around the same time, the king of Axum, Izana, embraced Christianity, and Ethiopia became a Christian kingdom, its coins now stamped with the cross for all the trading world to see. From that root grew a church that would translate the scriptures into its own sacred tongue, Ge'ez, and copy them by hand for the next 1600 years. Ge'ez is no longer an everyday spoken language. Like Latin in the West, it survives as a holy language, the voice of scripture and prayer, understood fully only by trained priests and scholars. And that is part of why the old book survived here. A church that copied its own scriptures by hand, in its own ancient language, in its own mountains, was free to keep what others let go. But Ethiopia's connection to scripture runs deeper still, all the way back, its tradition claims, to the age of kings and prophets. At the heart of Ethiopia's sacred memory is the story of the Queen of Sheba, the wealthy southern queen who, the Bible records, traveled to Jerusalem to test the wisdom of King Solomon. The biblical account describes her arrival with a great caravan of camels bearing spices, gold, and precious stones, and her wonder at Solomon's wisdom and his temple. She tests him with hard questions, and finds him greater than the reports she had heard. Then, scripture says, she returned to her own land. But the Ethiopian tradition, recorded in a revered national epic called the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings, continues the story far beyond the Bible's few verses. In that telling, the Queen and Solomon have a son, Menelik, who grows up and travels to Jerusalem to meet his father before returning to found a royal line in Ethiopia that would endure for millennia. And the Kebra Nagast makes an even bolder claim, one central to Ethiopian faith, that Menelik brought with him to Ethiopia the Ark of the Covenant itself, the sacred chest of ancient Israel. To this day, the Ethiopian church teaches that the original ark rests in the town of Axum, kept in a small guarded chapel beside the church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. It is seen by no one but a single appointed guardian monk, who tends it for life and never leaves its grounds, a tradition unbroken across generations. Whatever one believes about that claim, it reveals something vital. Ethiopia sees itself not as a distant convert to the faith, but as an heir of ancient Israel, woven into the sacred story from the beginning. That deep sense of belonging shaped everything, including which books the church chose to keep. Because Ethiopia kept a strong link to Jewish scripture and tradition, older books like Enoch and Jubilees, treasured in that ancient world, never felt foreign here. They fit. So they stayed. And the way those books were kept is itself a wonder. Every manuscript was made entirely by hand, a labor of months or years. The skins of goats or sheep were scraped, stretched, and cured into parchment. Ink was mixed from soot and plants. Pens were cut from reeds. And then, letter by letter, the scriptures were copied. The finest were illuminated, adorned with vivid hand-painted images of saints, prophets and angels in a bold, luminous style found nowhere else. Wide eyes, flowing robes, deep reds and golds, the unmistakable sacred art of Ethiopia, painted to make the holy stories shine on the page. Bound in wooden boards and worn leather, these great books were carried in procession, kissed, wrapped in cloth, and guarded in churches and cliff-top monasteries for centuries. And some of those monasteries are among the most remarkable places of faith on earth. On islands in Lake Tana, the source of the Blue Nile, ancient monasteries have preserved manuscripts and treasures for hundreds of years, reached only by small reed boats. In the north, at Lalibela, a king ordered churches to be carved directly downward out of the solid rock, entire cathedrals hewn from the mountain, still used for worship today. In these places, protected by stone and distance and devotion, the old scriptures were safe, copied and recopied, kept whole while the outside world changed and forgot. It is worth pausing on what that means. The differences in the Ethiopian Bible are not proof that other Bibles are wrong, nor that Ethiopia's is the only true one. What they show is that the Bible, across history, was never a single, fixed object handed down unchanged from the beginning. Different communities, in different lands and centuries, gathered, weighed, debated and preserved these sacred writings in different ways, guided by their own history and faith. Ethiopia simply kept one of the widest and oldest collections of all, and in doing so, preserved for the whole world books that would otherwise have vanished. The Book of Enoch that scholars now study, the Jubilees that fill gaps in ancient history, exist today in full largely because Ethiopian monks refused to let them go. And this is not a museum piece. It is a living faith. Across Ethiopia today, in these same ancient churches, priests still chant the scriptures in Ge'ez, still read from hand-copied books, still carry the old traditions their ancestors carried. At great festivals, wrapped replicas of the Ark are carried out in dazzling processions, beneath embroidered umbrellas, to the sound of drums, chanting an ancient prayer. The chants they sing were shaped, tradition holds, by a 6th century saint named Yed, whose sacred music still fills these churches nearly 1500 years later. It is one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world, unbroken from the age of Axum to the present day, still praying with books the rest of the world set aside. So the next time you hold a Bible, it is worth remembering that its shape, which books are in and which are out, was decided by long human history, and that not everyone made the same choices. In the highlands of Ethiopia, a different choice was made, and kept, for more than 16 centuries. There, the fuller, older library never closed. The Watchers of Enoch, the Years of Jubilees, the Martyrs of Meqabyan, all of it carried faithfully down the centuries by hand and by heart. It is a reminder that faith has many memories, and that some of the oldest are kept not in the great cities of power, but in quiet mountains, by patient hands, in a language of prayer. The Bible the rest of the world forgot was never truly lost. It was simply kept, waiting, in the roof of Africa, by a people who never stopped turning its ancient pages.